Hi, we'd like to thank you for tuning into the World Boxing Review radio show. My name is Aaron Snow. They call me the Hall of Fame trainer of champions, that we travel the world for past, present, and future stars. And I'm coming to you live from Tampa, Florida. We have Mark Irwin, who is the vice president of the Rochester and Buffalo Boxing Hall of Fame, who's going to be profiling um, Smokin Joe Frazier today. But in the meantime, before we bring Mark in, we want to wish each and every one of you a belated happy Thanksgiving. It's Saturday after that, and there's a lot of things going on in the boxing world. We'll try to fill it in from time to time as we go over a profile of one of boxing's great, Smokin Joe Frazier. Welcome into the show, Mark. How you doing?
Good, Aaron. Thank you. Same thing. I'm coming to you from a different location now from where I had in the past. I moved about a mile and a half down the street into a different house, but this was my first Thanksgiving here at the new place. So it was I was fortunate. I had all three of my kids here. They stopped in for a while. I had both of my grandkids. It was a lot of preparation and everything. My son had his in-laws live in Syracuse, which is about 2.5 hours from here. So he wanted to eat at noon. So of course that didn't come to pass. But we ate a little before 1, and the house was pretty well empty by 3:30. So it really, kids have other places to go and what to do. But it was a lot of
it was exciting. Turkey Day is always fine when you get a chance to Turkey Day, but we have to remember Carmen Basilio. Carmen. Look, let me tell you, he fought one time in 1955 on Turkey Day against the market, and it was an exciting fight. It was the second fight that he had. So just a mere bit of history for boxing. And after Thanksgiving in history, also over in Australia, Jack Johnson and Burns were finally working out the deal for Jack Johnson and Burns to fight over in Sydney, Australia, for the fight of the century in 1908. But in the meanwhile, the profile, Smokin Joe Frazier, or great like that, it's just simply amazing champion, amazing character when you look back in time in professional boxing. Let's get right into it, Mark. Smokin Joe Frazier, man. Let's talk about his early days as a young kid down there in South Carolina.
Well, he was born and grew up in Beaufort, South Carolina, and I think that's how it's pronounced. And he had a pretty impoverished upbringing, actually, and he started to develop fairly, working in the fields and everything. He developed, a lot of his strength early on in life. Unfortunately, he had an accident as a young man that damaged his right arm. So, you'll hear a lot of times that, Frazier was a one-handed fighter. Well, still, even with his damaged right arm, he's still, he's definitely still had his moments with it. But it did keep him from being able to extend it the whole way. So, that's why he relied so much on the left jab, and then, of course, his famous left hook. And, but he came into some, again, we have to take it, in the context of its times. He had some problems down with some of his white neighbors down in South Carolina, and basically felt like he had to get out of town when he was only 15. And which is pretty young for a kid to go out on his own at that age. And he saved up enough money to get a Greyhound ticket, and he went to New York City first, and then to Philadelphia, which is where everybody thinks of him, is from, and it was. That's where he lived his adult life, and he worked in a meat factory, interestingly enough, too. And you think everybody knows the movie Rocky, and Rocky having his friend that worked in the meat plant and would punch the sides of beef. Well, actually, Joe Frazier did that years before Sylvester Stallone even had any concept of that, anything like that. So it was actually, another Philadelphia. It was an actual Philadelphia fighter, Joe Frazier, that started doing that. Punching the sides of beef. So
well, he did a lot of that on the farm too in Beaufort, South Carolina. A relative of his was basically the one who got Joe interested in boxing, as Joe had spoke to me when I was young, and he had told me about how how he got interested in boxing, and he already always preferred me as Ali's guy. He said Ali his man, but I'll let him train here anyway. He can come in the air anyway. I know who his guy is. I know it's Muhammad, who used to say, yeah, let him go, let him train. But he said in the early days, family member who had really started him off in the house where he used to watch boxing, Sugar Ray Robinson and Rocky Marciano, those guys on TV, and what inspired him to wanting to fight. But
his house was one of the first that actually had a TV in his neighborhood, so a lot of the neighbors were over a good deal to watch it. And of course, boxing, I don't know. I look back on that, some ways I wish I could have been around then. When boxing was on 3-4 nights a week. They all. I mean, you had ABC, NBC, CBS, but you also had the Dumont network there too. When Dumont ran a lot of boxing in the early days. So yeah, you had that was a kind of a golden time for watching boxing on TV in prime time. It was. I don't think it was a great. Well, that's a subject for another show we could do actually about the 50s. The television. Certainly gave boxing a lot of exposure, and it was very popular in the late 40s, and 50s, but it also, kind of resulted, I think boxing club shows have been fighting to get it back ever since, back to something resembling where they were prior to that time. But anyway, on the subject of Frazier's early days, when he was in Burford, he made his own homemade punching bag. And I think as a trainer, and I was an amateur coach as well. I think we cringe at the idea of somebody hitting something like that because he filled it with sawdust and rocks, at the bottom of it for weight and other things. I'm sure it was not a real well-balanced heavy bag, but nevertheless, he certainly, developed his strength pounding on the thing.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're working on the farm, you get strength by the things that you have to do. You're baling hay and raking, and you're doing manual things that require strength a lot of times, like plowing and stuff like that. And Joe, his family was doing a little sharecropping back there in those days, and that's what he grew on. As they say, Tobacco Road. And they were selling a little bit of White Lightning too back in those days. When the people used to come over and watch the fight, they'd give them a little something to drink, keep the fights interesting and the conversation going. But Joe Frazier, from that background that he had, made him a rough and tough character. Man, Joe could take a licking and keep on ticking. He was like Timex, and because he was hungry from which he came, I mean, boy, he demonstrated that as he went to New York to hop on. As he said, he rode the back of a dog, meaning the Greyhound, the Greyhound buck, to get where he had to go at 15. But his family saved up enough money, and he did make it up there. And matter of fact, his brother, Tom, who was with Joe most of his career in those white limousines that Joe had, his brother Tom used to be the one chauffeuring him around. Tom was, and
Okay.
Tom was a character too. But Joe stayed in the early days, also up there in New York or Philadelphia with his brother Tom. Tom was a character in his own right, man. But hey, look, those early days of what culture infines you for yet to come, man.
Oh yeah.
Mark, let's talk about Joe's amateur days, because he was something as an amateur too, man.
Well, he certainly was. He certainly was, and you know, he went actually to the pretty much the pinnacle of the amateurs. But he had it's interesting. You know, I'm sure a lot of your audience remembers there was a fighter, Buster Mathis, and
Yes.
who was also a very good amateur, and he kind of had the derogatory nickname. They used to call him Buster the Blimp. And
Yeah,
he
because he was
big
big.
guy. Yeah, he
Not
carried
big
a lot
in
of weight
size,
on him.
but yeah, he
But
did.
but he had Joe's number though in 3-round amateur fights. You know, he just if the fight only had to go 3 rounds, Mathis did manage to outbox him. And Mathis was actually supposed to be on the 64 Olympic team. And but Joe was an alternate. Joe lost the final Olympic bout to Mathis, but then he went over as an alternate. And then Mathis got injured, unfortunately for
Mhm.
him, just before the Olympics were taking place. So Joe went in and took his place and went on to win Olympic gold. And of
Yeah,
course, I
well,
think we'll maybe get to it later in the show or whatever. Joe and Buster would definitely meet again in the pros, in a fairly significant fight. And when Joe won his first piece of the title, when he won the New York State Athletic Commission heavyweight title in '68, and thing with Mathis was, he, because of the size, because of his, he wasn't a real durable fighter. I mean, he could outbox guys in the early rounds. The trouble was, he was a guy who was kind of made for the amateurs. When the amateurs, when you only go 3 rounds, he was the perfect boxer for that, because he had very good boxing skills. He could take a punch. But he didn't really have the durability to go, into the later rounds, and with guys that really could hit. So, guys like Jerry Quarry, Joe Frazier, gave him, considerable difficulty, with his subsequent career. But he was a very good pro, though. I mean, I will say Buster Mathis, and his son was a very good pro as well, Buster Mathis Jr. So they were, they certainly were.
Smoking Joe Frazier, since he came up north in 1959 at the age of 15, and to go through that amateur place in Philadelphia where there was fighters on every block, it seemed.
Yeah.
In 1962, Joe won the Golden Gloves.
Okay.
That propelled him, that amateur background of winning championships. That Golden Glove tournament back then, boy, was that a big tournament to win, and Joe won that in 1962. So that was a major defeat for him in the amateurs.
Well, I think, yeah, you started throwing around the names. Well, we did a show on Philadelphia middleweights, and I think if you went back in 1962 and looked at the names of the guys or kids at the time, really, that were competing in the Pennsylvania Golden Gloves, and the Philadelphia Golden Gloves, it was a who's who kind of future notable boxers. And you're right. And Joe did rise to the top of that. And it was, and again, this is, you got to remember too, he was, he really was a kid at the time, and came from nothing, and actually did rise to the top of that. How soon into his career did he hook up with the NC Durham? Was he with the NC in the amateurs?
Not so much in the amateurs. Yank Durham, as we called him, Yank Durham. He hooked up with Joe, and Joe and him, they went on, in the amateurs. But then Yank was looking for a trainer to teach Joe just a little bit more about defense, not to get hit so much. You
Yeah.
know, because Joe could take a licking and keep on ticking, man. He was like Timex. He'll wiggle and wobble, but he wouldn't fall down, but he'd come storming back. So, you know, that was later on. He hooked up with a great trainer that I knew very well, Eddie Futch. He
Yeah.
went out to California with Eddie Futch, and him and Eddie would be locked into history in some great fights from near in the future. But, you know, Busters Mathis, as you said, you know, in 1964, you know, he just couldn't get past it.
Yeah.
But the Lord seen it that you know, Buster Mathis suffered an injury.
Yeah.
And that's how Joe made it to go on and fight in that Olympic tournament. You know, Joe after he replaced Mathis on that Olympic team, and boy, you know, Joe walked through guys. As a matter of fact, in the tournament, the Olympic tournament, he had a 40-second knockout. You know, yeah.
You don't see that a lot in the amateurs.
No, you don't. Joe knocked the guy out in 40 seconds, so that propelled him. And then he fought a person from the Soviet Union to win that gold medal in 1964. So he was the second American in a row from the last Olympics in that division, no other than Muhammad Ali winning. So those two Olympians eventually would meet up in some of the trilogy fights that boxing has to offer, Mark. And, you know, as you well know, man, boy, they were just some of the great fights. But, you know, coming out of the Olympics, let's talk about that, you know. Him, Joe, coming out of the Olympics, and what did it look like, Mark, for Smokin Joe Frazier when he came out of the Olympics?
Well, I'll tell you, you know, one thing when he came out of the Olympics, he really didn't have a lot of money. You know, it didn't. Of course, you don't get paid, and you know, Olympic. You know, they were very strict on the amateurs only in the Olympics at that time. So, you know, the Olympics ended, but then all of a sudden, Thanksgiving and Christmas were coming up, and he was having trouble buying food, and so a group of Philadelphia businessmen got together and organized what was called Clover Lay, and that allowed, you know, they raised some money. It was actually somewhat similar to the Louisville group syndicate that Ali had, but it was different in a little ways too. It wasn't quite as, I mean, the people involved in it weren't quite as well off. It was more like a local Philadelphia thing, and people, you know, contributed money to it, and, you know, by Clover Lay Corporation, and they helped, you know, Frazier with his training expenses and whatnot. And I'm trying to think of the announcer there was
Larry Merchant.
Larry Merchant, thank you. And
Larry
Merchant was an early. There was a few other people that were well known.
But you know, Larry. Most of the people remember Larry Merchant on the HBO telecast, where he would used to say things basically that a lot of people didn't like about fighters and things like that. But before Larry Merchant became a commentator on television and HBO, Larry Merchant used to work for the Philadelphia Inquirer. He was a sports writer.
Yep.
And in him writing sports, he used to write a boxing column for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And I think they said that, as I recall, that he had made a small investment in Joe Frazier's boxing career, where he put up some pennies to help Joe Frazier out. But when you're trying to collect money, every little penny, every little dime, every little nickel helps. It did help Joe Frazier get on his way. To pursue
as we talked about, as we talked about before, you know, the Olympics, it's kind of sad now to see the Olympics kind of lose some of their luster as far as American boxers going into the pros, because that is kind of an interesting fact, you know, that of the 4 heavyweight champions in a row, Floyd Patterson won the Olympics in Helsinki in 52, then became heavyweight champ in 56. Ali won in Rome in 1960 and became heavyweight champ in 64. And Frazier won in Tokyo in 64 and then became, he got a piece of the heavyweight championship, the New York State part of it in 68. So 4 years later. So all three of them were kind of on a 4-year plan, to get to the top. I think we could talk about the Ali Frazier fights. I think it would have been, I wish some way you could go back in time and know, because there was some talk of Ali and Frazier fighting in 68. And of course, they weren't letting Muhammad fight at that time. So, it would have been interesting to see if, when Ali was at his absolute peak, of him and Frazier meeting. Because they probably, if it hadn't been for Ali's suspension, him and Smokin Joe would have probably gotten in the ring in 68 or maybe early 69, somewhere in that vicinity.
Yeah, absolutely. And for our viewers tuning in right now, we have Mark Irwin, who's vice president of the Rochester Boxing Hall of Fame and the Buffalo Boxing Hall of Fame, here profiling Smokin Joe Frazier. So if you're just tuning in, that's what we're talking about, Smokin Joe Frazier. Mark, you're right at the cup from that New York heavyweight title that he had, Smokin Joe Frazier, from 1968 till I believe it was 1973. I believe it was in that time period.
January 73 is when he ended up losing the title. So, yeah. But going back, of his early record, there was not a lot of real well-known, there's some that were marginally. People that know boxing knew him. But the first one that stands out to me was Dick Whipperman, who was from Buffalo. And that bout was actually held at MSG. So that was, I believe that was Frazier's first headliner at Madison Square Garden, was against Dick Whipperman. And Whip was a good, he was actually a very dear friend of mine. He was a local cop, Cheektowaga, actually, which is fairly close to me. And he was a good heavyweight. I think some people thought maybe he had a shot going in, but Smokin Joe took him out. Well, stopped him actually in the 5th.
Yeah,
at MSG. And there's still some.
That was a little time after Joe turned pro in 1965, right, against Woody Gross or Grouse. How do you say that? Gross or Grouse?
Goss. Yeah, Woody Goss. Yeah. Woody Goss. He was around. Actually, Woody Goss was he was a trial horse, whatever. If you put him, but he was probably, I don't think he was a pushover fight, and Joe stopped him in the first. So. Stopped him in the first round. So that was in Philadelphia. And you say he had some others that were Mel Turnbow. He was around. Again, Joe stopped him and won. But then he fought, Dick Whipperman. They also fought Charlie Polite, who was a decent.
Charlie Polite. He found out that Joe ain't too polite.
He actually, Charlie Polite was a decent fighter, though. Again, he was a trial horse. He wasn't really ever a title contender, but he was a decent fighter. He was actually one of the ones. Remember when years later when George Foreman fought the 5 fighters the same night? Charlie Polite was one of them. Yeah. And do you remember that? And Ali was yelling instructions up to him, and he actually stood in there for the distance there with Foreman in that go. But anyway, he kept fighting different. Well, I would say the most important fight. Well, he had Billy Daniels, who was actually a very good fighter. Billy Daniels had fought Ali as well earlier in his career, and he ran into Daniels. I'm going to say sometime around 66. And Billy managed to last 6 rounds with him, which was actually the way Joe was smoking in those days. That was actually a pretty good performance.
Yeah, ain't no question, man. Like Ali used to say, Joe be smoking and he don't be joking. he laugh and joke, but Joe don't play, boy. And let me tell you, let's, since we're into his pro ranking, Joe was only 5'11".
Right.
And, his weight, 229 around in between 216 and 220 as he matured, as he grew as older. But Joe wasn't a 5'11", man. That's not, in the real scheme of things, he wasn't that big, but the way he fought made him look big in size height. And, with a reach of 73 and a half, man, he can wing from banging from that injury that he had when he was young.
Karen?
When he whipped that left hook around, boy, he could really, really get it off.
Yeah, he certainly could. It was, I think the one that, you're talking about the size wise, he was probably about the same height as Rocky Marciano, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Them guys weren't big, but boy, could they put that pressure on you and could punch like a mule. Both of them. Rocky Marciano could kick just like Joe Louis could kick. And let me tell you, two phenomenal fighters with a slugger style of boxing, boy. And to fight like that, you have to be in dynamite shape. It's not an easy thing to fight like that, because you have to sometimes absorb punches. And both Smokin Joe Frazier and Rocky Marciano, boy, could they, absorb those punches and bang. But, when he won the title in 1964 to move on as turning pro in 1965, his total pro fights, Joe only had, 37 or so fights, correct?
That is absolutely correct. Yeah. And he had 36 when, that 37th one was kind of a, we can talk about it a little bit. That was kind of I think that might have been a bit of an exorcism. I think he needed to get it out of his system. I think guys always think they got one more fight in them. And I'm sure Joe didn't like, going out the way he did against Foreman on Long Island. So I think he wanted, but anyway, yeah, we could talk about that. But, you look at Frazier's record, the only two guys he lost to, he was 32-4-1, in his 37 fights. And the only two guys that he lost to were Foreman and Ali. So,
yeah,
really, there's certainly no shame in losing to either one of those guys. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think two that probably are pretty much everybody's top 10, Foreman and Ali. And it, so, yeah, I mean, I think, Frazier is definitely an all-time great. I don't think there's any question about it. I don't know, I don't know top 10, but he's certainly in the top 15 or 20. I think Ibro rates him about 12th, if I'm not mistaken.
Hey, let me tell you, a whole bunch of these heavyweights nowadays, Joe Frazier would have cooked them.
Oh, yeah.
They talk about, they never seen, let me tell you, I seen Joe Frazier train, and boy, like all of those great fighters from George Foreman, Muhammad Ali, Rocky Marciano, when Joe Frazier would hit the bag, the whole building would shake. I mean, you could hear the thump and the bump, and boy, the speed and the enthusiasm that he showed hitting the heavy bag and the speed bag and jumping rope. These young guys nowadays, all they want to do is hit the hand pads, but man, could they thump and bump a heavy bag? Joe Frazier could, man. He'd rattle the whole building when hitting a heavy bag. Up there in North Philly, right off of Broad Street, where he had his boxing gym, man. And let me tell you, man, his whole family, got into boxing. But we're going to talk a little bit about the fighting family members a little later in on the show. But Mark, I had cut you off when you were right in the middle of getting into the Joe Frazier Muhammad Ali fight there in Madison Square Garden in New York, man. Hop into that and build up the build. Talk about the build up before they fought.
Well, absolutely. when Ali was stripped of his title and suspended, not allowed to fight anywhere. No states would give him a license, and he wasn't allowed to leave the country. So during that period of time, the WBA had an elimination tournament, and Frazier decided to sit that one out. He actually decided not to go in it, and that was Yancey Durham's thinking on that, and it was probably a wise decision. I think Frazier would have probably won it if he'd been in it, but it was kind of a dog and pony show too, where they had a lot of boxers being brought in there, whereas the promoters at MSG were willing to put them straight to the. It wasn't just New York State too; it was about 4 or 5 other states. I know Massachusetts recognized Frazier's championship as well. And it was kind of the predecessor, what became the well, I won't say that, but it was New York State Athletic Commission held a lot of sway in those days. If you were champ in New York, you were thought to have about half the title, really. And so they set up the match with Buster Mathis, which actually, interestingly enough, was the first boxing card in Madison Square Garden, but Emil Griffiths was fighting Nino Benvenuti the same day for the middleweight crown, and that was actually the main event. The Frazier Mathis fight was the lead into that, I believe. And but Joe won it. Joe won it in impressive fashion. I mean, he knocked out Buster, laid him out. You see a lot of pictures of big Buster on his back, and he carried him. Mathis lasted 11 rounds with him, which was actually a pretty good performance. Then after that, he had a number of fights. He fought a big one was Jerry Quarry. Quarry was from California, but he was Irish Jerry. He was very popular in New York City, and he was always a good draw into Madison Square Garden. And he gave Joe a little run for his money in the beginning of the fight, and then Frazier wore him down and stopped him pretty cold after that. But I think by this time, of the people that were still being allowed to fight, I think most people after that Quarry fight pretty much regarded, even though Jimmy Ellis had won the WBA crown, I think most people regarded Frazier as the best active heavyweight at that time. So, in 1970, the state of Georgia, decided to give Ali a boxing license and allowed him to fight there. And he had his fight against Jerry Quarry. Well, of course, we know, Muhammad stopped Jerry in the third on a caught and in Atlanta. And that was, that fight was a pretty major event, when Ali's comeback fight. And then Ali next fought Oscar Bonavena, who had given Joe fits, actually. He gave him a really tough go for his money. Knocking him down twice, actually, in their first fight. Now, Frazier beat him quite a bit easier in the second fight, but he had beaten him, Bonavena was a pretty big test for Joe. And he certainly gave Ali some difficulty, too. Ali was the first man ever to stop, because Bonavena was an extremely durable fighter. And Ali did actually stop him in New York in the 15th round. So the lead in, for this fight, they'd fought, a lot of the same guys. And I think there were a lot of people that thought by that time that Frazier actually was the best fighter out there. And then there was a lot of people that were
after he knocked out Jimmy Ellis in grand fashion style. Jimmy Ellis was a stablemate of Muhammad Ali.
Yes, and Ali helped him train for that fight. Ali actually helped Ellis train for it, and he was sparred with him. And you're right about that. That was that fight was a pretty big event, actually, that unification bout. And Ellis did. I'd say he held his ground for the first couple of rounds, but then, boy, Smokin' Joe just started landing on him. He actually got through the fourth, but Dundee wouldn't let him come out for the fifth. And I think if you watch the fight, it's pretty clear that Jimmy had enough. He had all that he needed of Smokin' Joe at that time. And so that, as far as the commissions were concerned, that made Frazier the unified champion in 1970. So He did, but I think an awful lot of people, myself included, still regarded Ali as being the real champ. There was to me, you didn't really become the champ until you beat the champ. And, Ali clearly, hadn't been beaten yet at that time. So this was, a time where you actually had two undefeated heavyweight champions meeting in the ring, in March of '71, and they both had their partisans. And if you watch that fight, it's always amazing. You see the early '70s, the fashion statements. I mean, the men in the fur coats and, the women dressed up. And it was really, you don't ever see that at a fight anymore too much, the people dressing up to go to a boxing match. But it was an event that, like the boxing world had never seen before, really. Because again, I don't know how you'd ever top that, really. You had two, undefeated champs. Back when there was
Bob Arum was the promoter of this fight, Top Ranking. For a lot of people who don't know, Top Rank was formed by Muhammad Ali's manager, Herbert Muhammad. And I don't understand why Herbert Muhammad, a longtime manager of Muhammad Ali, is not in any of the boxing Hall of Fames, including the International Boxing Hall of Fame. He managed Muhammad Ali most of his career. And to see all the top ranked guys' names go in the International Boxing Hall of Fame without Herbert Muhammad going in, because Herbert Muhammad was the one who started Top Rank. Ain't that something? It's just simply amazing. And Top Rank was the one who did Joe Frazier's fight with Muhammad Ali in Madison Square Garden, known as the fight of the century, man. And boy, did it live up to the billing. Talk about
it certainly did.
The fight itself, Mark, and some things that happened that shocked the world in the fight.
Well, let's go back to. I just wanted to go touch back for a second. You were talking about the promotion, though. That Jerry Parancino there. That was he was the promoter of record of that fight, I believe. Wasn't he a movie guy out of Los Angeles that was kind of trying to get into boxing?
Yes.
Okay. Anyway, but they pulled it together. I think people got to remember too, that Ali and Frazier both got paid $2.5 million. We're both guaranteed $2.5 million. That doesn't sound. It's still a lot to me, I got to tell you, but it doesn't sound.
In that time, that was huge money.
That's huge money.
During the
that was huge money
because fighters weren't getting paid like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, Time Magazine had a cover, the $5 million man. Remember that? It was like, it was inconceivable to people that, because like in those days, Willie Mays was the top paid baseball player, and he got $160,000 a year then at that time. So he made $160,000 a year. These guys got $2.5 million each. Ali always claimed that he actually netted about 800,000 out of it, which is still an awful lot of money, but he said after, I know New York, believe me, I've lived most of my life here, and we have very high taxes. And after they take their hit and whatnot, the $2.5 million got reduced, which Ali always liked to point out. But anyways, going in, I think it was just about the early parts of the fight were just pretty much about what you'd expect. It was Ali was moving, and Frazier's trying to bore in. And of course, you compared Marciano and Frazier, but one thing, Marciano, he was more subtle with his head movements, like he would get himself out of the way of punches like George Chuvalo did. But Frazier was kind of more of the bobbing and weaving style, and Ali, you can see him with the jab there. He's, moving around trying to peck away at that. And Ali ran up a little bit of an early lead early in the fight. But then, when Ali couldn't get up on his bicycle so much, Joe started landing on him, and he was doing some damage with that left hook. I mean, it was finding its mark on Ali. And it was... I would say neither one of them was in any real serious trouble until the 11th. But the 11th round was actually, there's a brief time where Ali went down for a second. That almost looked like that could have possibly been a knockdown. But I knew the referee, Arthur Mercani, in that fight. I did get to chat with him about that. And he said, no, it was a slip. Mercani believed at the end of the 11th if you remember the fight, Ali, kind of wobbled back to the corner, and Mercati said he was just playing possum. He didn't buy it at all. Mercati didn't seem to really think he was in any serious trouble. What do you think about that?
Well, styles make fights. And in this fight with Ali and Joe Frazier, it's a classic matchup, when it comes to style-wise and making fights. It's slugger against boxer, boxer against slugger. And, many people had told Muhammad Ali and warned him many times about pulling back from punches and without countering. They said if you pull back and you get away from a punch, you got to come back with a counter. If you don't come back with a counter, if you're pulling right back into the punch, and the only place that you can go is down. And finally, from the long layoff and not being able to train a lot, you could see Ali's speed that he had 4 years ago as a younger man and training all the time and being in shape had started to dissipate and wear. And as ways he could get away from when he was younger, now those mistakes had came full front and center against Joe Frazier.
Yeah.
Like you said, in 11th, Joe Frazier was coming up, banging him to the body, and Ali would get off, and Joe Frazier was trying to hit him with that left hook, and Ali would just pull back just a little, and it'd go right in front of him and by him. But this time, Joe Frazier opened that hook up just a little bit more when Ali pulled back. When he pulled back, he pulled right into how Joe had opened that left hook up. It nailed him, and he went down. And it shocked everybody that Ali had went down on the deck. But don't forget, earlier in Muhammad Ali, over in England, Cooper had hit Ali with the same type of left hook. So with a master trainer like Eddie Futch, who Yank Durham had hired to teach Joe how to bob his head and catch punches a little bit, bobbing and slipping as you come in. Eddie Futch had smartened Joe up a little bit. Eddie Futch was the head trainer when Yank Durham went to California to get Eddie Futch, and Yank Durham had became the assistant. And masterful Eddie Futch that found a way to find a win for Smokin Joe Frazier in the first fight. And boy, man, what a tremendous man. They thrilled the crowd in the garden. People were on the edge of their seats. There was many sways of back and forth and oohs and ahs because the punches, you could hear the snack, crackle, and the pop, the fizz and the zizz. But Ali said, man, Joe Frazier was just simply something amazing. And how these guys in boxing history and sports history are etched in time together. Because if you say something about Muhammad Ali, they're going to mention Joe Frazier somewhere in the conversation. And this is what great fights and great bouts. The build-up.
I think you had to have been around at the time. I was I'm trying to think. I was about 12, I guess, at the time when they fought, and by the build up to that, the excitement of it, it was just like nothing anybody had ever seen before, honestly. And I don't know, as far as going into the mainstream of the public, I was a boxing fan when I was 12 years old, I'll tell you, and I knew something about boxing. But that day, oh my gosh, everybody in school, everybody was talking about boxing, and everybody had an opinion. A lot of them were very poorly informed, but nonetheless, they had opinions about it anyway. And it was pretty mixed. I think probably a few more people were rooting for Ali, but there was definitely some Frazier fans, at least where I was. There was definitely some people rooting for Smokin' Joe too. So it was. I'd say the crowd. You watch that fight. It seems like the crowd was pretty mixed too. I mean, there was some partisanship both ways in that direction, but it seemed pretty even. I'm sure a lot of Joe's, because it was in New York, so it was a lot of Joe's friends came up from Pennsylvania, and it was.
Well, you have to realize something, Mark. A lot, and for the listening audience, I want you to understand something. When Ali was in exile for refusing to go into the draft, he was living in Cherry Hill, New Jersey at the time. And he would come in the Philly very much. But Ali had went on hard times during that period. Joe was fighting. And, Joe helped Muhammad Ali financially.
Yes, he did.
Through those times. So we want the listening audience to know, a lot of that was the hype to fight, but at some point it did become personal. Because Joe Frazier felt that he helped Muhammad Ali, and then Muhammad Ali start putting the wrestling stuff down on him, where he had the things where they would go in the studio and Ali would want to fight him and tackle him and stuff like that. And then he would say, "Oh, man, look at Joe, it's hard, boom, boom, boom. When I hit Joe, boom, boom, boom." He would do all kind of things to make mockery out of Joe Frazier in his style. And at times it got beside Joe. But I can say this. In the end, him and Joe Frazier were absolutely friends. Joe was just that type of guy, and he went back down, but they found common ground, both of them. When Ali heard
it was one of the sadder aspects of the whole thing. There a lot of years did pass. That Frazier was, that they were kind of unreconciled, and you always like to think that, two guys that had like a trilogy like that they would actually be friends. But I can remember being in Canastota, and Willie Pep and Sandy Sadler fought each other 5 times. They fought each other 5 times, and I'll tell you, even as old men, they really weren't friends. I mean, they
no, they
there
used
was
to
still
get
some
into
animosity there all those years later, and that to me is always sad to see. I just, you always really hope people can patch it up, and usually in boxing it's not personal, but I you can certainly see where Ali, did make it kind of personal for Frazier. And I think Joe didn't, he certainly didn't like, and some of the worst of the stuff, that Ali threw at. There's no, it's a shame that it happened. It's a shame that it happened, but I like to believe they were, reconciled by the time that Joe passed. I also, later on, well, we can get into it in a little bit, but I mean, I was at, I'm sure you probably, were you at the Ali Frazier daughter fight at Turning Stone?
Daughter fight, yeah. I was somewhere around.
Okay, because I was there for that was the IBF show-off weekend, and I was definitely there. I had a very good seat at it too. They at Turning Stone, they had a little closer quarters in those days. They weren't trying to sell as many tickets, so it was that was a very memorable fight as well, actually.
The fighting Fraziers and stuff like that, man. Joe with his gym. Many people emerged out of that gym in North Philadelphia, like Smokin Bert Cooper, Marvis Frazier, who was Joe Frazier's son, and his daughter, Jackie Frazier. She emerged. And if you remember the great fights that Layla and her had at that time. So, with Layla and Jackie Frazier, that came where Joe and Muhammad Ali were right there with that. So, Joe Frazier did a lot for Philadelphia. As Philadelphia has always been named the fighting capital of the United States, because so many great fighters came out of Philadelphia. They were always known for their toughness, their bold, their brass style, and that Philly left hook that Joe Frazier, put Philadelphia on the map for that left hook. But, Joe Frazier's daughter, Jacqueline Frazier, she ended up being a lawyer. She's a lawyer now. And also, she is a judge. Oh. And I'm going to show you a letter that she sent me with her district court letterhead.
Okay.
Jacqueline did. And I was just I seen Jacqueline down at Atlantic City Boxing Hall of Fame. She was there, and I was touting the Jack Johnson Legacy belt. And she stood there and took the picture, and we talked about old times with her and Marvis. And I could remember the day crystal clearly when Joe, Marvis, and them came to Muhammad Ali's training camp for a media day. Joe came up to Ali's camp when it was all finished. And that was the first time I met Marvis and them, and they still remember that today, as we were all young and we had a chance to hang out, move around together and talk with Marvis and his father and them. So Joe always remembered that. So when I used to go into Joe Frazier's gym in North Philadelphia, he used to say, "That's Ali's guy." Yeah, I know, but he's here. Let him alone. That's Muhammad's guy. Let him alone. He all right. Joe used to tease me like that all the time when I would come into Joe Frazier's gym. But
was Joe calling him Muhammad at that time? I mean, because I remember he was pretty resistant to the name change there for a long time. Yeah. Joe liked to call him Clay, and
Joe would call him Clay. But after a while, like anything, change is hard. But Joe, he would say it. He would call him his name of that day. So so let me tell you, man, Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali. Let's jump right into, what people just recently, it was 50 years ago with the Thriller in Manila. I mean, the viewership, the after viewership of that fight, and people still watch that fight today in tape, and they're just in awe of that fight, the Thriller in Manila, and it has an echoing sound that when people talk about boxing, they always say the Thriller in Manila or things like that. Talk about that, Mark.
Well, it was a remarkable fight. It was a remarkable fight, and it was just, it probably was the best of the three. Although I don't know, some people might stick with it first, but I think that it. I don't think going into that people thought that Frazier had as much left as he did. I mean, Frazier definitely came to get his title back. There's no question about it. He was there in the Philippines, and of course, there was a lot of buildup prior to that. Ali was, making a lot of derogatory comments toward Joe, and Ali had some business going on in his personal life as well, that was kind of flaring up over there in the Philippines. And, again, I think, most people that care about it know about all that was, what was going on at the time, but with Ali. But, Joe was, Eddie Futch was over there. They had a strategy and they had him ready. He was, the late Don Dumphy said he thought around round 8 that Frazier was actually going to win the fight. It was, it was Ali.
It was one of those fights back and forth and back.
Yeah.
Ali would get 3 or 4 punches. Joe would come back with three or 4 punches. It was one of those fights. It was back and forth, hit and don't get hit, and then just putting it together. And when Ali would put 3 or 4 or 5 shots together, going down the stretch, Joe would come back with some fights, but, with some punches himself. As both of them sat in the corner going into that round, that famous round, Ali had said, Muhammad, he had told me, he said, man, I almost, was getting ready to quit. And he said, Joe Frazier just gave it up before he did. And if you watch the film, how Ali looked when Angelo was telling him to stop in the fight. And you gotta, with Eddie Futch, a great trainer, all-time great trainer against Angelo Dundee. Those kind of matchups today with fighters and trainers, you don't see them too many often, where you see the wit and the grit where it comes to boxing knowledge and having a fighter ready. Those type of matchups with trainer and fighter, great trainers with a great fighter. With this fight, you had it. Eddie Futch against Angelo Dundee and Muhammad Ali, and Eddie Futch with Frazier. And to see those type of matchups, man, you don't see that in boxing too much now. Because a lot of the great trainers and stuff like that are not around. With those guys, the Angelos, the Eddie Futch, and those type of guys. I went up against them as a young guy. I trained Tim Witherspoon when against Angelo Dundee when Tim Witherspoon fought James Quick Tillis, and he stopped James Quick Tillis, knocked him out in the second round in outside of Cleveland.
So in that arena. Tillis at that time?
Yeah, at that time when Tim Witherspoon knocked him out. Yeah. And then also Angelo Dundee, we went up against him again. He got us this time in a close split decision with the WBC heavyweight championship on the line with Tim Witherspoon against Pinklon Thomas. Pinklon Thomas edged us out with a real close split decision where Tim Witherspoon lost the WBC heavyweight championship bout. But the last time I was up against Angelo Dundee was a fighter that you're well known, that is in the Rochester Boxing Hall of Fame now, the Cincinnati kid, Tim Austin.
Oh, yes.
At the Paris Hotel on co-main event of Evander Holyfield and the Weiss Heavyweight Championship card. Angelo had Arthur Johnson, and I had the 1902 bronze medal Olympic winner, Tim Austin, the Cincinnati kid, and they went up against each other. And Angelo had Arthur, I had Tim Austin, and we came out the victorious one with that, where Tim Austin went on to victory by a shutout, won every round of the fight, boxed his rear end off. Tim Austin did, who without a doubt, a lot of people forget about Tim Austin, but Tim Austin, man, could he punch?
Oh, I agree.
And could he box his rear end off? He was in the pound for pound list at one time. A lot of people forget that. With 30 fights and 27 knockouts, man, Tim Austin was a KO artist too.
Oh, yeah.
He wasn't big in size. He was big otherwise. And to fight with a broken jaw, 8 rounds to win a championship of the world, second to none. But the Rochester Boxing Hall of Fame, I want to thank y'all. Y'all recognize all of the great stuff that he did. But Angelo, that's why I'm saying these things about the great matchups of great trainers and fighters. And also with Eddie Futch, I have a card that Eddie Futch signed for me one time. It was a bookmark. We were at a dinner in California, and me and Eddie Futch were sitting together. I know Eddie Futch for a long time from being in Philadelphia in different gyms and different fights. So Larry Holmes, when he fought Tim Witherspoon, Eddie Futch had trained Larry Holmes when Larry Holmes edged out a decision over Tim Witherspoon, where many people thought Tim Witherspoon won the fight. So we were talking about that one day, that fight, and Eddie Futch reached in his jacket and he had a bookmarker, Eddie Futch bookmarker, and he wrote on the bookmarker, to Aaron Snowell, one of the greatest, youngest trainers I ever seen in my life, signed Eddie Futch.
Yeah,
And
that's quite an honor coming from him. Yeah, he was a wonderful man. Eddie Futch was. I think Ring Magazine.
Yes, he was.
At their Ring Magazine's what was it, 85th anniversary? They proclaimed Futch the greatest trainer of that first 85 years. So I think that sounds
yeah. And the reason why I'm saying and talking about great fighters, and with that Muhammad Ali Thriller Manila fight, Eddie Futch made a tremendous call at the line of scrimmage. And sometimes as a trainer, it's tough to do, but you got to know your fighter and have to know where the fight's at. For him to have in a big guts heavyweight championship fight with everything on the line, to know that his fighter had spilt it all and left it all in the ring. And it's better to one punch too soon than one punch too late. Eddie Futch made a tremendous call in the corner and said, "My fighter, I'm stopping it. You had enough. You can't, that's it." And Eddie Futch stopped the fight, and it was the right call to make at that time.
Well, I think you have to remember, Frazier one eye was completely closed, and the other one was about half closed. So you're talking about a blind fighter. That's something that we didn't bring up, but Frazier didn't have real good eyesight to begin with. He was actually legally blind in one eye through a lot of his career, and from an accident. And so no, you can't let somebody go out there blind. And I think Joe wanted to, actually, but. When you watch Ali, in the other corner, I mean, he jumped up, to exulting in his triumph, and then came right down and collapsed back in the stool. I don't think Ali was terribly anxious to come out in the 15th either. I think it was I'm sure it took a tremendous toll physically on both of them, actually. But you are right. Yeah, I mean, Ali was going to win the fight. And it was, some people. If you actually look at the scorecards of that, Ali was ahead enough that all he had to do was last the last round, and he would have won. So I think it was definitely the right call. Joe didn't need any more.
Yeah, well, hey, look, at the end of his career, or time after that, his losses twice to George Foreman, being stopped and things like that. Boxing, it has took its toll, and Joe, made a decision after Jumbo Cummins and all of that kind of stuff. Is that it was time to call it a day and say, that's it. But when you talk about greatness, now let's look at some of the awards Joe won. Ring Magazine Fighter of the Year, Joe won 1, 2, 3 times: 1967, 1970, 1971. As Fighter of the Year. Also, 1, 2, 3, 4 times from the Boxers Writer Association. He won Fighter of the Year in 1969, 1971, 1975, and they gave him an award in 1999. Man, you're talking about a span of time for a great fighter to receive those type of accolades from those type of organizations is second to none, man. To receive those type of awards, Mark.
But he was in the inaugural class too of the IBHOF too in 1990. So he was one of the very first. The first year that Hall of Fame even existed. He was in the first class. So I think that tells you a lot of what you need to know. He was on question first ballot Hall of Famer, first year Hall of Famer.
Okay, let's close here because we've been over an hour. We're over a lot of time. But in closing, what do you want to say, Mark?
Well, I think that I think it's very important here in 2025. If you really want to know about the history of boxing and of the heavyweight division, I think there's no question. Smokin' Joe was one of the best there ever was. I mean, he had again, as I had said earlier, but I think it's worth repeating. He fought pretty much all of the top heavyweights of his era, and the only two that beat him were Ali and Foreman, so I think that's I think that tells you a lot of what you need to know when you think again he fought George Chuvalo, Jerry Quarry, on and on and on. I mean Eddie Machen, we didn't bring that one up, but Machen was a very slick boxer. But also too with Frazier, I think that he tried to stay involved. He stayed active. He did train. He was Rodney Bobbick. It was Dwayne Bobbick's brother. He was actually his manager for a time, but he also worked with Dwayne Bobbick as well. Those two brothers made some noise in the 70s, and so the man did live a life of service. He loved his country. He was a good man. I think anybody that met him, he was he was very fan friendly individual, and and I think he was you look at the success that some of his kids have. Obviously, he was a good dad too. So I think Joe Frazier was a good man. I'm glad he finally got his statue in Philadelphia. That was long overdue. And I think that any serious study of the heavyweight division, would certainly have to include a big part with Joe Frazier.
Absolutely. And don't forget with that left hook and Joe's singing talent with Joe Frazier in the knockouts.
The knockouts.
Hey, man, Joe did it all, man. Well, what a great morning. Just to follow up with some stuff here. We mentioned George Foreman. It looks like the Leland auction is auctioning off George Foreman's gold medal that he won in the Olympics. So that's some boxing news. And they're talking about Anthony Joshua's up and coming fight December 19th. It looks like it's going to happen with fake Jake the Real Paul. They're saying that they're blowing up Anthony Joshua's pictures on the poster to make it seem like he's real extreme, the opposite of what happened with Gervonta Davis. Let's see, with that big deal they cut for multi-millions of dollars, it's being reported is that they're fighting for some type of prize money, which is $140 million prize money or something. But, I think with Jake Paul and these type of gimmick things, he's walking on a fine line of what we don't want to say, but, fight fixing is a heavy crime. And I hope Anthony Joshua, as being a gold medalist, two-time heavyweight champion of the world, these guys have to stop getting involved in those type of antics. The Muhammad Ali Act and all of that are supposed to protect fighters and is supposed to protect the general public from being distorted of real facts. Boxing's a real game, and boxing has stood the test of time. And when fight fixing was brought out, in Madison Square Garden, with when they were running the mob and all of that, boxing fixed that type of behavior so fighters and the public wouldn't be distorted of the real facts. And I hope, Jake Paul, man, you do a great promotional job. Let's try to keep it on the real side, because that's what makes boxing boxing. People love the real side of boxing. They love where people start from poverty, like we talked with about Joe Frazier being a sharecropper growing up on the farm, poor burlap bag, holes in the shoes, and rise to greatness. And that's what boxing's all about. You don't have to make nothing up or fake something. All you got to do is tell a real story of these real fighters, their different struggle called life, and what each and every one of us go through, and you don't have to do anything. But Mark, It's been great this morning to sit here and talk to you about Smokin Joe Frazier. What a gentleman and a
Absolutely.
scholar, and boy, a great champion.
Yes, he was. Yes, he was. You know, normally I like to show our listeners, your listeners, some of my memorabilia. Well, as I told you before, I actually just made a move, so I was trying to. Most of my stuff is still in boxes for the most part, but one thing I did bring out was this. Let me stand up here. This was on. This was in the background in my old office, and it
Okay.
was a piece. Flip-A-Motto.
Smokin Joe Frazier.
Flip-A-Motto was the artist's name, and that was going along what we were talking about, that Frazier was in the opening class of the International Boxing Hall of Fame. That was a kind of a promotional item from the IBHOF, and it's been on my wall in my old house. It was on my wall for several years, and him and Larry Holmes, two of your fellow Pennsylvanians, and
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and someday we'll do a show on Holmes. That'll be a fun show for sure.
And I think we can get Larry Holmes. I'm going to announce something here in the up and coming weeks about Larry Holmes. Man, what a great fighter, great champion. And Larry Holmes and Joe Frazier, they were buddies, and they went on that tour with Joe Frazier in the Knockouts. At one time, Joe Frazier and Larry Holmes were going around a singing duo. You know, oh boy,
I didn't know that. I did not know
but
that.
we have on tape when Larry Holmes got inducted in the Rochester Boxing Hall of Fame. It was around the Christmas dinner.
Yeah,
he was singing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
He did.
Yep, he did get up and do some singing, and he danced into the night too. Yeah, he was a great. He had a great time at our dinner. Yeah, I can remember there was some TV network did an interview with him afterwards, and he actually took the guy over and showed him his plaque from Rochester. He was very pleased with that. And so, yeah, Larry Holmes and Joe Frazier actually were both Rochester Boxing Hall of Famers as well. And yeah, Holmes, that was a very memorable dinner, and he, like I say, made himself very available that year to the Rochester fans, and it was great having him. It really was. He was a wonderful guest, and Joe Frazier was there 2 or 3 times in Rochester as well. So, you know, we loved having him.
Well, we're going to end on that note, Mark, and we want to thank each and every one of you for tuning in around the world to the World Boxing Review radio show. My name is Aaron Snowell. They call me the Hall of Fame trainer of champions, as we travel the world for past, present, and future star. And profiling Joe Frazier was Mark Irwin, who is vice president of the Rochester Boxing Hall of Fame and the Buffalo Boxing Hall of Fame. Each of those Boxing Hall of Fame, he is vice president of them. Mark Irwin, great job. Thank you so much, and I hope the fans enjoyed it today.